Thanks so much. And if you're eating, you can turn on your webcam because humans eat. If you don't want to, that's fine too. So let's just start by, I'm curious to know why you're here. So maybe you could take a few minutes, think about like why you really came to this. What was the motivation to come to this session, what you're hoping to get from it, and then put your thoughts in the chat and we'll start from there. So what brought you and what you hope to leave with? Okay. 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 So some new strategies to teach, uh, understanding sort of the sciences about learning, to kind of inform. Great. Let's see. Okay. So I guess what I want to do is first begin by sending you to breakouts. I know we always do this, is because I want you to get a chance to talk to each other a little bit about what teaching has been like in your classes. What are your students like? What have you noticed? What do you feel, when you're teaching students? And so I want to give you first to talk to each other, and then we're to come back and think about your students holistically. So I'm going to set you into some breakouts. And just give me a second to do that. These are gonna be super small. I'm gonna give you like 6 minutes. So this is gonna be like a lightning round. How are your students presenting? What are you learning about them? How are you feeling in relation to them when you're teaching them? And then we'll come back and talk a little bit about some of the themes that emerged. Back, it's always a good sign when people don't come back immediately. It means you're using that very last minute. So what were some of the things that came up in your conversations? Let's just do a couple check-ins. What were some of the themes? What were you seeing in students? And also, what are some of the feelings you're having about teaching students at the current moment? So whoever wants to start, let's just we'll popcorn around.
Well, we were talking about, as I'm sure everybody probably was, about how it seems like students are way more like looking at their computers. They might be taking notes, but they might not be, or they might be sort of flipping back and forth, like taking some notes, but then checking email, maybe doing a little shopping, maybe like doing some web searches and stuff like that. And it's I was saying that I have a lot of guest speakers, and I feel really bad to ask people to come and talk to a group of students that are just like obviously doing something else. So I don't know.
Okay. How about for others? I know one of the things that Jeff put in the chat was one of the reasons he was here was to find ways to work with and engage students who are overwhelmed by screens and lengthy readings. What are you noticing about their ability to learn or their approach to learning that may be at times interesting, challenging? Have you noticed anything about that and the students' needs with regard to learning?
Are you directing this question to me?
No, I'm directing to the group because I think what you wrote, Jeff, I think is something we hear a lot about at CELT, and that faculty are having to change the way they assign readings and things because students have a harder time getting through the readings. Or so just sort of wondering what other sort of habits or ways of being that you've noticed in your students that have been perplexing. Go ahead, Amy, you'd have to raise your hand, just jump on in.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, that since they're feeling overwhelmed with the content and how to tackle it. And, I think sometimes they go to this model of, I have 8 to midnight, I'm just going to go. And it just seems so overwhelming with everything that they have to do. And they're not really taking that time to plan out their time management of what they're going to do. And they really don't have a sense of how to chunk the information, and if we take that time to break it down into smaller chunks where they have certain readings, they have a checkpoint, they have certain things that they need to do, we can kind of help guide them in how to break it down into smaller chunks. I feel like that helps decrease that overwhelm for them.
Mhm.
And providing types of clear as mud like question like FAQ boxes in Canvas, so they feel like they have the space to pause and say, okay, I have a question with this. I don't have to try to spend an hour feeling overwhelmed with this content. I can send a message, whether it's like the group discussion board or to that individual instructor, and then continue to move forward. I think those things I've experienced tend to help the students feel a little less overwhelmed when we cite to help teach them how to chunk it and let them know if they do have questions that they can reach out. I mean, I'm always ever um, blown away at the number of students that won't come to office hours, right? Or student hours because they're just fearful of it. They just haven't been in that space. And once they realize they become a believer of coming, it helps them to not feel quite so overwhelmed with the content because it gives us the opportunity to show them how to break it down.
So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how you use class time. The pedagogic interventions that you do during class time can also be ways that you're coaching students about how to go about learning more effectively. And so I appreciate you bringing that up, Amy, because you have to coach them. They have worked really hard to get into college or graduate school. They're clearly really bright, competent human beings. But then they get to school and it's a kind of volume that they're not used to potentially. And also there are other factors that are affecting their ability to be attentive and to remain engaged. And so I think it's important that while we're thinking about what are the challenges, also, but what strengths are they bringing as learners that you've noticed? So if you can think of picture your student, the students you have right now, what are some of their greatest strengths as people and as learners in the classroom? What have you noticed? Just feel free to call it out. You don't have to raise your hand.
I think they're much more intentional about work or school life balance. But I
Yeah.
also think from the flip end of being a Gen Xer, that it's hard for me to understand that and have them translate that they have to do the work. And, I'm in a different space. This is new. I'm from the PT program and teaching online, and I've never taught in a hybrid program. Our learners are very diverse and diverse, not just ethnic diversity, but also age. And so you have a various platform of people. I think their awareness of mental health and some of the limitations within that are better than they've been. I think it's strength. But I think it's a matter of harnessing those strengths and recognizing that there's work to do. And kind of speaking to earlier on, a lot of our students have been conditioned in K through 12 where they have not been challenged and they come to graduate school and it's like a 2x4 to their head. And so I think a lot of times it's a matter of like grounding them and understanding, yes, that they've done the work to get here, but it's not a matter of just sitting. It can't be a passive process. And I always go back to it's a bidirectional process and bidirectional learning and bidirectional relationship for them to have to show up. And I think that some of the things that we were talking about in terms of our struggle in our short 6 minutes, we could have gone for probably 45. But I think that just recognizing our learners, and as healthcare providers, I always parallel education with clinical practice. When we're person-centered in clinical practice, we have to be learner-centered in education, right? So just trying to find that balance to be able to serve learners the best way that we can.
Yeah, really important points, which we're going to come back to. Anyone else want to sort of share kind of what are the strengths you're seeing? Because those strengths live alongside the kind of vulnerabilities and challenges that you've also surfaced in every moment. They are there in the learner in the same way. And also another thing that, is it Kara or Kara?
It's Kara. Thanks for
Kara, okay,
asking.
just making sure. Is that another thing that Kara mentioned is that we have to see the humans who are in front of us as the humans they are, not the humans we were, the students we were, the contexts we learned in. And a lot of times it's really hard to look at them and actually not look to see some reflection of yourself in them. I did this too, I walked uphill both ways to school in the snow kind of thing, but it's more who is truly there and what are their needs and what are the contexts? how has the context for learning changed? And also what I'm going to talk about in a little bit is that their biology is changing. We have MRIs that are showing that digital natives, kids who you're now seeing students who, since they were little kids or babies, have grown up on screens in ways that many of us did not. And so the role of screens in their lives in terms of as tools for learning, as tools for socialization, but it's also begun to change their anatomy. And when your brain changes physiologically, it impacts a whole host of things that then manifest in the ways in which they learn, the ways in which they may struggle to learn. I also heard a statistic that 1 in 4 adolescents between the ages of 13 and 17 is what is considered addicted to screens. Now, the research on this is really fuzzy because we're all addicted to screens. But the difference is that their prefrontal cortex is still developing. And so it has a different impact on them than it might be on us. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a minute. I just want to ask one more person to share. What are some strengths that you notice in learners that we haven't yet surfaced? So a mental attention to balance, a mental health. I see emotional intelligence. What's another strength that you see?
I was going to say they're very good at presenting and putting together presentations, but then less good at putting down thoughts in writing. And what I'm kind of curious about is how they are best able to kind of take notes and absorb information, because I see that many of them don't take notes and just sort of look at stuff afterwards. And how is that impacting their learning? Yeah.
Okay. And we're actually going to talk a lot about that. There's some techniques that you can use in class to help them focus, and jotting down ideas is one of those. So although I'm not a big fan of PowerPoints, I'm going to show you a few slides because I'm going to spend a few minutes giving you some information that I feel like it's helpful to have some visual reference. And I will kind of move between the deck and conversation, but every few minutes, I'm going to stop what I'm doing. I'm going to ask you to do something. These are techniques that are also, I want you to think about trying to use in your classes. So one of the things I learned, I spent pretty much 6 weeks this summer immersed in language, in research about neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm a social worker by training. I don't know a lot about brain chemistry. I only know about it when it pertains to trauma, but I didn't really know what it meant as it pertains to learning. And so I am presenting a kind of synthesis of what I learned, and in a very much a lay way. So for those of you who may have any grounding in cognitive science, this is not going to be on par with what you may already know, but it's helped me really shift my thinking about learners and who do we need to be as educators for our learners. One of the things that sometimes comes up, and it's very real and very valid, is that faculty feel often exhausted by all the things they're doing to accommodate today's student. That they're often feeling like I am twisting into a pretzel to be the educator my learners need, and it doesn't seem quite enough. And if you can relate to this, just either nod, do a little dance. I see you. And I am not going to suggest anything today that causes you to twist more. What I'm suggesting is how you structure class and how you integrate throughout class sort of intervals and spaced practices with retention and cognition. Well, actually, these are also things that they can use as studying. So you may find that in class, you get a different quality experience, but it means you have to give something up in class to create a few minutes here or there to do these things, to check in with them, to help them really process what it is you're teaching them. Because if you don't, they're not going to get it. And they're not going to stay with you. And so it's sort of, what do I want to kind of continue to get in all the information I need to impart to them? Do I want to give up a little bit so that what they're getting is better quality and more deep, and maybe they're able to then apply it? And so I just want you to think about that, because it means you have to not work harder to meet their needs. It's that you're meeting needs differently, but it may mean that you're sacrificing a little of content. So let me share my screen, and then whoops. talk a little bit about what that means. Okay. Okay, so let me just, we've talked about this. So I'm not going to go into presenter mode if that's okay. But, and I know some of you may have seen this, but this is a collage that I created of all of the factors that the research talks about that are impacting the learners sitting in your classrooms right now. And when I say learners, I'm aware that some of you are teaching graduate students, but it impacts them too. It may impact the learners in undergrad a little bit differently. So what we have, I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about, these are factors that truly impact your students' development, their cognitive development, as well as their social, psychological, and emotional development. The first one I was talking about is the brain. So this is a picture of a child who's a toddler, and this is a child who's had almost an hour of exposure to a screen, practically since birth. This is a 3-year-old brain. And all of that area that's lit up is something called neural disorganization. And it's happening because the matter in the brain is, they're showing that there are parts of the brain where the dura is thinning, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. That is the part of the brain that continues to develop into your 20s. And as you're going to see, has a tremendous impact on how students learn, how they relate in social environments, how they relate to you, all of the things that are a part of being in college or graduate school. As they're developing those parts of their brain, their neural networks are different. So I want us to think about our learners, not in terms of abnormal development or any of the kind of negative nomenclature that sometimes is attributed to today's learners. But their brains are different, and we have to think of that. This is the new normal. The other thing I want to show is that climate change is a significant factor in today's, particularly in Gen Z, is that climate change causes such anxiety, the not knowing, the uncertainty about their future because of the state of the planet is a significant factor. Some students are more attuned to it than others, but the studies show that that most, particularly undergrads, are coming to campus with a whole host of anxieties, and this is a profound one. And I'm sure somewhere, can't you see right now, Tina Wolston is probably going like, amen to that. In this if you look at the underneath the brain, you'll see it's 2 people, and there's like this knot of almost threads. That is interpersonal difficulty and conflict, that people are not learning as well how to manage interpersonal challenges. In some ways, we see that happening across campuses as students are engaging in a great deal of conflict, particularly around national and geopolitical issues. But that ability to have conversations that are civil, respectful, that aspect of our development, we're seeing change. And that's both contextual and also as a result of neurological development. In the middle, you see a person underneath a blanket looking at a screen. This is actually not about screen addiction. This is about sleep deprivation. Because of screens and because of multiple stressors, kids are not sleeping as much as they need to. This is actually a chronic problem. But the prolonged lack of sleep, the sleep deprivation that goes on for years, is never recovered, and that also impacts cortical development. Next to that, you see, it looks like all these little bubbles from social media, and all those numbers represent likes. This was something I found incredibly interesting, and this was in research that was done in the UK, East Asia, and the United States. And I will say that the UK and East Asia are so far ahead of the United States in terms of this research. It's really interesting. But that these likes represent the student or your learner's sense of self-esteem, their sense of self-efficacy, the way they curate their lives on social media, and the fact that for many of them, for years, they are used to putting something out there and it being responded to in fractions of a second. And that response tells them in some way they're okay or not okay. So I think of this as like, how does this impact you as a teacher? When a student comes to you and they feel like you owe them 2 more points on an exam or a paper, in some ways that interaction is fueled by years of you're either thumbs up or thumbs down. And professor, I'm a thumbs down if I don't get this A. I need those 2 points to get an A, so I can get a thumbs up. And also, these 2 points are going to determine the course of my life. That's how weighty that sort of sense of validation and affirmation from you is. But it comes from years of training, and social media has a lot to do with that. So social media is really seen as one of the most important factors in terms of your students' ability to relate, handle conflict, manage tensions, because their sense of self is so dependent in many ways on the kind of external validation they're getting from their peers and from you. In the lower left-hand corner, we obviously have Trump and Kamala Harris. We have an upcoming election in less than 3 weeks that is causing quite a lot of stress in your students, and don't underestimate it, even if they're not talking about it. In the middle, you see kids with masks on, COVID. Your students are students who critical academic, intellectual, social, relational development was deeply impaired by COVID, and that for many of your students, COVID was an extremely traumatic experience. It might have been traumatic for you, but imagine being young and dealing with food scarcity, with lack of access to appropriate healthcare, housing insecurity, all of the things that were amplified and magnified by COVID, many of your students lived through, and that caused significant disruptions in their development. And the last corner is the geopolitical instability. That is a current but ongoing factor in the kinds of stressors that impact your students' ability to be present and engage in their learning. So all of these things are drains on bandwidth, emotional, cognitive, and interpersonal bandwidth. And that's combined with the fact that the brain chemistry and the brain anatomy is changing. So what does that mean? So these are the functions associated with prefrontal cortical development. So put a thumbs up if you've seen some evidence of this in your learners as you're working with them, that they sometimes have difficulty with reasoning, problem solving, and decision making. Thumbs up if you've seen that. Ability to retain and recall information and the ability to maintain focus. Thumbs up. Emotional regulation, that your students may seem fragile, they may become easily or seem easily dysregulated in class. Thumbs up. That sometimes your students are not able to maintain what is considered, now we can unpack this, but not at this moment, socially appropriate behaviors, but socially appropriate for the context. That sometimes they don't know how to behave. This may manifest in a student writing an email to you that seems like they're writing to a friend, a peer. This sort of lack of the sense that maybe writing to you requires a different language or different address. I don't know if that's one symptom of this, but a kind of not always knowing how to read the social cues in a space. Have any of you seen students who have really had a hard time planning and switching between tasks? This is particularly noticeable if you're working with students who are doing clinical training and they have to move between tasks quickly. And that students are sometimes having a hard time setting goals that are long-term, but delaying gratification to meet them. Have you noticed any difficulties with impulse control? So students making very quick judgments without being able to think through the permutations or consequences, which is the last bullet as well. So these are things that are all associated with prefrontal cortex skill. And so it's really important to understand that this isn't just about context. This isn't just about this new generation. This is related to the ways in which their brains are developing. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for a second. I'm going to stop sharing. And now I want you to, in the chat, take a minute and put 3 things in the chat, but don't hit enter. What are 3 things that you are thinking about, or 3 new ideas that you've learned so far in this conversation today, either from each other or from what I've just shared from you. So put your 3 things in the chat, but do not press enter until I say enter. I'm going to give you a minute to do that. I want to see. When you've got your 3, just give me a thumbs up, and then I'll see when the group is ready, and that way I can say enter when you're ready. But don't put it in yet. I just want to see if you're ready. Okay, Tina? It's okay. So when you're ready, just give me a sign. Wait, don't enter it yet. We're gonna do it all together. And we're just gonna crowdsource what you've learned.
The problem is it won't let you like, there's no way to like go to the next line without hitting.
No, at least that's okay. That's okay. Okay. All right. Put in what you've got. Enter. Let's see what comes up. Okay. Great. So what we just did is something called jot recall. This is a technique. This comes from Barbara Oakley's work, and I'll give you the references at the end. But basically, every 10 to 12 minutes as you're teaching, you should do something like this, where you stop and you help students or give students a minute to put down on an index card, or if you're teaching online, you can do this in the chat, where they have to stop and think about what they've just heard. And if they can't recall anything, that means you're not ready to move on. It means they're not processing or they're not taking in. They're listening, but they're not hearing what you're saying. And so it's also those people who are wandering into social media or they're shopping a little bit, it brings them back to the room. So these every 10 to 12 minutes, it may seem like a really arduous thing, and you might have to set your watch, but you don't want to get so far into a lecture or into a conversation and you're like, I don't actually know what they're hearing. I don't know what they know. How are they making sense of it? So it may mean that you almost keep a timer or keep little reminders for yourself that every 10 to 12 minutes, stop and do something like this. Thank you, Carrie, for that helpful hint about what to do in chat. Another technique that you can use, and these again take minutes, is that you can actually have them take a moment where they close their books, they close their laptops, they put their phones away, and you can say, okay, put your devices away, put your books away, close your eyes or look at a point in the room. And I want you to repeat to yourself 2 things that you've just heard or just learned from our conversation or from the lecture. And then you can ask them to either enter into the chat, or you can have them do it on index cards. If you're in a classroom, you can have them do it on index card, and it doesn't mean you have to collect it, but the index cards that they start to do jot recall on become study guides for them. They can use those ideas to then study on their own. So when you do something like this, the important part is to not just do it, but coach them and say, not only, it's true, Carrie is just, Jean likes to say, and this is my favorite Jeanism, is that Carrie just walks around dropping knowledge on all of us. And did you know that I coined Jeanism? So it's the joy of working with my team. So when you do these little techniques that take a minute or 2, first of all, those index cards can also be the source of a conversation that they have in a think, pair, share, a small group discussion. So you're gonna come back to them and use them. You don't collect them. These are no stakes formative assessments of what they're learning. That's also a moment you could do on an index card for yourself. Right? What's a clear point and what's a muddy point, or what's a question, which I think Amy mentioned before. they're memorializing their thinking and learning for themselves, not in performance for you at this point. You just want to make sure you're staying in the weeds with them so they're getting what they need. Okay. And we'll get to some more techniques in a moment. So any questions or comments before I move on? Does that feel clear? So when I say you have to give up something, I'm not talking about huge swaths of time. I'm saying every 10 to 12 minutes, do something that takes 2 to 3 minutes. And that will promote re-engagement, and that will help them be able to say to you, if you say, okay, did anyone have a hard time finding one thing or two things or three things? And is there anything you want me to just repeat or go over before I move on? And then you do that and you move on. And you might say, but Dana, that's going to take time away from what I need to get across to them. I need to teach certain content. It won't take a lot of time. But remember, if you're teaching concepts and they're not getting the foundational ones, you're not actually moving on. You're just overwhelming them with information or content that they aren't ready to use. So you want to try to stay in the weeds with them. Yeah, Jenny.
So I'm teaching in a hybrid program as well. And I'm curious if there's much research or literature about doing this with asynchronous lectures, where maybe students are is there like an effective way to prompt students to do this on their own after watching an asynchronous lecture or assignments?
I think it's a great question. And having taught online, I would say I would use in the asynchronous videos, I would actually space them. So you're the one, like through a video or whoever's creating the async is saying, okay, let's take a moment and you're embedding those knowledge checks into the asynchronous work. And so I think you can also upload little videos of here's a tip for studying. So while you're reading this chapter, it's a lot to read. Set a timer, like almost like a Pomodoro method for reading. Set a timer, and every 6 to 8 minutes, whichever you choose, just stop and think to yourself, what did I just read? Or can I summarize the concept I just read in 3 words? So the 3-word or 1-word summary is one of the easiest things that you can do at any point in any modality of teaching. You can do this in a lab. You can do this in the classroom. You can do this while you're walking. If you're going out to a site, you can say, hey, what's 1 word that summarizes what we're about to do? Or you're thinking about what we're about to do. If you're mentoring or precepting a student in a clinical situation, okay, we're about to meet this client. They have this issue. What are 3 words that come to mind about their diagnosis, if you know it? So you're constantly prompting them, and that's actually called jot recall, where you're asking them to recall concepts, but in very fun sized, like Halloween candy sized components. You might want them to be on the theater candy train. They're not ready, my friends. You've got to be patient. And so as you do this cumulatively, you can start to ask them to recall more and more information. And another thing about assessments, do this as a formative assessment. These are not graded. These should not be for performance. These are to promote learning. But as you assess them, make sure the summative assessments are cumulative. You want them to constantly. So I know that when I was a student, I was like, ugh, I hate cumulative assessments. I have to study harder. But you want to be on the first, summative assessment of the semester. You deal with what they've learned so far. Embed in that assessment a question about something that has yet to come, but don't count that as a graded question. So you want them to take the knowledge they're applying and apply it to something they haven't quite learned and see what they do with it. And that's actually how you build a kind of your scaffolding. So then when you introduce the concept to the next module, they actually already have like, oh, that's familiar to me. And that also builds grit, and it also builds a sense of comfort that's like, oh, it's not complete. I'm not a total tabula rasa. This is a concept. I didn't know what it means, but I'm familiar with it. As you assess them across the semester, keep bringing back content from the previous modules and add it to the stuff you've just taught them. so that they're building a kind of set of, you're building to where then the final assessment should integrate concepts from the entire semester. Where you're spacing, you're giving them these increments in which you're asking them to practice working with knowledge they've acquired, applying it to things they haven't yet acquired. And that's something that often faculty don't do. It's like, it could be even a bonus question. It could be a couple of, extra credit. It's like, give them a problem, a vignette, a question where they have to recall something that they've learned, and give them the heads up. Each time I assess you, I include prior knowledge that you've acquired. And I may ask you to stretch your wingspan and practice using some muscles. You may not be quite ready, but I want to see how you do. Those are not going to be graded questions. Only grade them on the questions that have to do with the current content, but keep reminding them that the knowledge builds. Okay. And then on that final summative assessment, grade it all. So I know they don't love that, but that's really important for retention. So they're not just learning a module and then forgetting it, and then learning a module and then forgetting it. You keep building and building, so they're carrying through all of the information from the prior. So I'm gonna share my screen again.
Sorry, can I ask one question?
You can ask 2 questions.
Okay. I I think everything you're saying makes great sense. The class I teach, there's no right or wrong. The whole point of the class is that it's sticky, it's complex, there's nuance. We need to, think about these topics and have different perspectives. And I just want them to go away being able to think critically about the topics and about how we look at media and, et cetera. So for these kinds of activities, like I really want to, what I'm battling in the classroom is that they want there to be a right answer, and they want to give me an answer I think I want. When I don't care if you disagree with me, like that's totally, I welcome it, but I want you to have an opinion you've come to. So is there a way of doing some of these check-ins that doesn't, I think I'm really struggling getting them to break out of this idea that, there is some kind of exam. I don't do exams, we do projects, we do reflections. So I'm just curious if you could talk about, 1 or 2 ways of getting them, like I've tried the 1-minute paper, I've tried some things, but it is hard, I think, getting them to really, I don't lecture for a long time, but even in the little bits I'm lecturing, some of them are zoned out. So I get wary of doing some of these where it might come off of like, where they may see it as like, oh, there's one thing I'm supposed to be recalling. So I'm not being very eloquent in this question, but I think that's where I'm struggling a little bit, is how to apply some of this in a context that there isn't like a final exam with these specific things they need to know to take, I don't know.
So
If that made
learning,
any sense, sorry.
it absolutely makes sense. So I think that this is one of the things too, that our understanding about learners today is, they had to really succeed in a system where they were taught how to learn to succeed, that there's almost a game they've had to play to succeed, to get to college. I remember when my son went, when he was a freshman in college, he was asked to write something for a psychology class, and he wrote it the way he'd been taught in high school. And the teacher kept challenging him and saying, but what do you think? What do you think? How are you making meaning of this? And I remember him calling me, and he was in tears. He was like, I can't do college. I have to come home. And this was a kid who had worked so hard to play the game right. And when someone actually said, you can take notes the way you want to, you can write the way you want to, you can talk about what you think, he didn't know how to do that with any confidence. He didn't know, because he had been taught to play the game where it was, I have to say the right thing to get the grade I need to do so I can do this, and then I can get here and get here. And we see this in students all the time. I'm sure some of you have students who are like, just tell me what to do. I'll do whatever you want so I can get the grade. But you're trying to teach them how to think for themselves in a world that requires a kind of grit and persistence and an approach to thinking where they have to grapple with all kinds of different things. And then where do I come out with what's my opinion? So I think in those cases, I would do a lot of activities where you're actually asking them to do this in mini bursts. So don't just start with a larger assessment, give them ways to, if not the minute paper of what are you taking from this, but what is a new idea that's making your brain hurt? Or what is a new idea that is unsettling your assumptions about the world? What is a new concept from this conversation or this reading or this lecture where who you thought you were and how you thought you believed, what you thought you believed about yourself and the world to be true has been shifted. That's when you're using those moments to both actually practice retention and recall, but you're giving them a chance to practice exercising a freedom of thought they may not know how to. And that the feedback you're giving is about supporting how are they constructing the idea? Is it grounded in something? Give the feedback about the not the idea so much, but the approach and the courage it takes to have an independent idea and to put it out there in the world. You all know this as scholars. It can be terrifying to put an idea into the world. Well, they don't know how to do that because no one actually said it. Most of the time most systems suggested it wasn't okay. You have to coach them and you have to teach them how to do that as much as you're teaching them the content. Caitlin.
Yeah, I just have a quick question in that thought. Like, does that relate to the concept of like ungrading or like grading for like equity practices? Like, how does that kind of funnel in to a teacher approach to like kind of like break that student mentality that they have to like get a grade? Like, does that relate at all?
It does. And that is another conversation because I want to give you some more techniques. But if you want to talk about that some more, reach out to Self for sure.
Great.
I think, and for some students, that is a really scary thing. And so, and therefore it takes some courage on the part of on faculty. But I want to get, I see we're coming to the end. There are a couple other techniques I want to talk about. The one thing also is it's really important to really assess prior knowledge when they come into the class. Prior knowledge doesn't just mean what do you know from the canon of this, but what life experience, what other kinds of experience, cultural knowledges might give you some way and a portal into understanding the content. So really getting a sense of, whenever I taught, I always would ask, whenever we started, I would start every class with, here's a concept, what do you already know about it? It wasn't who knows about this, it's what do you know about it? Or what do you think you know about it? And I began every class centering what they knew. And then we would sort of list all the things that people thought they knew. And then as the conversation or as the lecture or or whatever we did, the learning activity, I would point back to the things they said they knew and how right they were, even if they weren't sure. So it's not about the right or wrong, it's the what do you think you know, so that it shows them that they're coming into this with already with some life knowledge that they can use. And you're trying to build up a kind of confidence in their ability to say, okay, you're not just the expert, you have certain expertise, but I'm actually can be an active participant. I'm not a blank slate. And Jim Lang in his book Undistracted talks about really using the first 5 minutes of class to build on prior knowledge and using that as a method too to promote engagement. And as they start to wane, you can come back to their prior knowledge. And you can sort of point to, and this was said in the first 5 minutes of class. We're now an hour into the class. And can you see all the ways in which you as a group came in knowing quite a bit about this and you didn't even know it? And so again, it's showing that they are active participants in their learning and that they have a lot to offer. So that's another activity. Another one that I really like that's also from Jim Lang is where students are keeping a learning journal. And you give them time during class, at some point in the class, to take a few minutes to write an entry in their journal. It's almost a message to themselves where they say, Dear Dana, it's 11:25. It's not actually, it's 10:55. And you ask them, you give them a prompt to help them engage in a journal for a writing session for 5 minutes, in which you ask them to distill what are the moments of this class where some idea made you take notice? Or what was a moment when you felt connected to the conversation and why? What was the theme? What was being discussed? Or you could ask them to write about, just journal about what you don't get. What's feeling fuzzy? What are you feeling confused? What's making your anxiety? What's exciting your anxiety right now about content? And just write about it for the next 5 minutes. Now you might be wondering, why would we have them write about the things they don't understand? It externalizes their anxiety, and then they're more able to communicate to you what they don't understand. It normalizes that everyone's going to sit in a position of not knowing. The thing we can do for our learners that's so important to keep them engaged is not to keep testing what they know, but to keep reminding them you're in school because you don't know. And that is exactly where you need to be. And you're going to be in a lot of not knowing, which feels uncomfortable. So when that student wants an answer, they want you to tell them what to do, you can sit in the space of not knowing with them and say, I know it's really uncomfortable. It's mushy and gross and it's gray and no one wants to be here. But we have to be here in order to figure our way out. I used to have a professor who would just say, like, no mud, no lotus. When I was a doc student, and I hated that because I didn't want someone to say I needed to be in the mud longer until I found the gosh darn lotus. But our students are looking for certainty in an uncertain world. And this is one of the ways they're seeking it. Be in the unknowing, the not knowing with them. And so the journal is a wonderful way to help them think about what they're learning and what they're beginning to know. And it's also helping them elucidate in very important and communal ways that the not knowing is something they all share and that you expect them not to know. You know, we only have 3 more minutes and we're coming to the end. I'm just wondering if you could take a minute and put into the chat, what is something that you're taking from this time together that you can use? What is a concept or a practice? I'm happy to share the deck with folks. It's from a different presentation. There are many more interventions, but if you also want to talk to any of us at CELT, we're happy to help you take a deeper dive. I also want to put a plug in for the next workshop session. Heather, can you say a few words about that while folks are doing their little exit ticket and what they can expect from your amazing session?
Thanks. Yes. So I think in the next session, we're going to focus on the perceived difficulty of learning. So the idea that learning is effortful, and particularly right now when not just students, we're all feeling a lot of distractions, how to help students stick with that hard feeling and help them develop some metacognitive skills around that so that they can be better, they can gauge more accurately what they do and don't know. So those are the types of things we'll be focusing on next time.
Thank you. And Carrie, can you put a plug in for your session?
So the third session will be focusing particularly on large lectures. And I know a lot of things we did today are applicable regardless of size, but we'll spend some time trying to think through and apply these techniques when there might be hundreds of students in the classroom or 75 students in the classroom.
And I'll put in a not so shameless plug that the December Teaching Symposium, which is offered both in person and online, will focus on learning. And we're going to have a panel from folks from Tufts talking about basically the not knowing as a critical aspect of learning. So if this has kind of gotten you interested, please reach out to us if you want some additional consultation, but also know there's just a lot of programming happening over the course of this semester to help you begin to really diversify the approaches that you take. So remember, what today's learner requires is from you is understanding and compassion, but also you need to change your pedagogy, but not radically. You just need to spice it up with some new techniques that don't take a ton of time. But remember, coach them and say, these things we're doing in class, you can do on your own as you're studying, and that the quality of time that you're using studying will be better spent and you'll get more from it. So thanks so much for your time today and look forward to seeing you at future events. Thanks so much for coming. The recording.
Thank you.
You're
Thanks so
welcome.